currently work in the capacity of consultant to the center, and I welcome you all for making it tonight. ISHQ, as you know, as an acronym, stands for Issues in Society, History, and Queerness. And as a conceptual rubric, it allows us to think passionately about issues of gender, sexuality, fantasy, desire, and politics through the rubric of the series. This is our first talk in the spring semester 2021, and we have a really wonderful speaker for you tonight, Alka Kurian. Please welcome. She is an associate teaching professor at the University of Washington Bothell and a recipient of the 2021 Fulbright US Scholar Award to Morocco. She is the author of Narratives of Gender Dissent in South Asian Cinemas and a co-editor of New Feminisms in South Asia, Disrupting the Discourse Through Social Media, Film, and Literature. And as those titles would suggest, she really thinks across multiple media, multiple genres of thought, and we would really like to hear more about it. The title of today's talk, as has been announced to you, is Golden Age of Social Protests, Rise of Fourth Wave Feminism. Without wasting much time, I'll give it over to Alka. Just before that, for our audience, just a little bit of logistical thing. Alka would be speaking for roughly about 40 to 45 minutes. During that time, please feel free to send your questions, comments, thoughts using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll take those questions up in the last 15 to 20 minutes of the session. All yours, Alka. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I feel very privileged and honored to be able to, talk to all of you. Sorry. Right. So there's been a renewed interest in feminism globally for a while now, going by a heightened visibility of feminism in the media and popular culture. Scholars, activists, students, as well as some celebrities and politicians across the world have aligned themselves to a feminist zeitgeist. And yet the popularity of feminism has suffered cracks within the movement, and there have been massive backlashes. Feminists are trolled, they're attacked, given all kinds of threats, rape threat, and even death threats. But despite it all, feminism is attracting a lot of attention. This resurgence of feminism is all the more significant because it has never operated in a more difficult political and cultural milieu. The success of the #MeToo campaign is an important milestone that exemplifies this feminist resurgence. As we know that soon after the Harvey Weinstein incident, it spread like wildfire. Immediately in the immediate aftermath of that, it spread like wildfire in at least 85 countries, and it grew after that. And as a result, leading members of the entertainment industry, the sports industry, many places in the academia and politics were publicly shamed. They were let go, forced to resign, or they were fired in countries across the world, such as China, Egypt, India, and the United States, and in many other countries. In addition, the #MeToo testifies to the power of social media in surfacing the culture of misogyny across the world. It was also foregrounded by the Time magazine as a feminist resurgence. However, this social media-led feminist activism was not the first of its kind. And in fact, the #MeToo campaign was initiated 10 years earlier, even in the United States, by the African-American feminist Tarana Burke. So I'd like to share some images of some of the movements, some of the digital activism or digital feminist activism that has been happening for a very long time. And I'll share this with you now. So for example, as we all know, the 2011 Arab Spring, which happened in the MENA countries. So that happened, the Arab Spring is also referred to as a Facebook revolution, and that happened in 2011, way before the actual, the MeToo, #MeToo movement. And I hope you can see these images. And then you have in 2014, the #MyDressMyChoice happened in Uganda. In 2015, you had the #Naked protest that happened in South Africa. In 2015, again, #MyFirstHarassment in Brazil, and this refers to the harassment of school kids at the hands of their teachers. And you can see the school kids as young as this. In 2016 in Pakistan, we had the hashtag Girls at Dhaba campaign. And you're free, please feel free to ask me what these movements refer to. Girls at Dhaba, it's a wonderful movement that happened in Pakistan where women urged each other to post their pictures of having tea at dhabas, in a place where, in many countries in South Asia, where occupying public spaces for women is a dangerous and hazardous activity. In 2003, in fact, I should have given it a little earlier, you had the Blank Noise campaign in India, where girls just took the liberty of literally going to sleep in public spaces. The wonderful 2009 Pink Chaddi campaign that happened in India, 2011, the hashtag Why Loiter movement, and of course, the 2012 anti-rape protests that took place in India. Then the Pinjra Thor movement that happened in 2018, started in 2015. And ever since, it's been spreading globally. I'm going to just show you a few more images before that we take a look at this Chilean anti-rape anthem. The 2019 onwards, there's been the pro-democracy protests that have been happening in Hong Kong, and women have been taking a lead in that, coronavirus or no. In Mexico in 2020, there was this red shoe protest against femicide. These red shoes represent shoes of women that have been left behind who are no longer there, so the gap that they represent. And in 2021, the anti-military protests that happened in Myanmar, women were at the forefronts of this movement. Then 2019, we had and 2019 to 2020, the Shaheen Bagh protests, and finally the farmers' protests. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Shiv or Shreyashi, one of you, could you please share the Chilean anti-rape anthem, the video of it, please?
Sure, Alka. Just give me a moment.
Yeah.
El patriarcado es un juez que nos juzga por nacer, y nuestro castigo es la violencia que no ves. El patriarcado es un juez que nos juzga por nacer, y nuestro castigo es la violencia que ya ves. Es femicidio. Impunidad para el asesino. Es la desaparición. Es la violación. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Ni loco, la culpa se le pagó, ni me pagan, ni loco. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. El violador eres tú. Son los pacos. El Estado. ¡Asesino! El presidente. El Estado opresor es un macho violador. El Estado opresor es un macho violador. El Estado opresor es un macho violador. El violador es tú.
Thank you. So clearly, as we can see, central to these movements is social media, where campaigns are either born online and then they transition offline to street activism, or they're sometimes born on the streets, but the images and videos, the YouTube videos, Instagram and Twitter, across all of these videos across all of these platforms, they spread the message in a matter of nanoseconds that galvanize support and stir the movement. There are no gatekeepers for the information that you want to put. Of course, there are protocol that is put in place about all kinds of terrible things that can also be put, but we're not going over there. So we're just talking about the ways in which there are no gatekeepers, and as long as you have access to technology, and regardless of your social, ethnic, class, national, ideological, religious, etc. positionality, you can say whatever it is that you want to say. So the ultimate what we see over here is an ultimate democratization of knowledge production and dissemination, which until very recently was guarded by multiple levels of elite privileges. And of course, there is backlash, there is trolling, and there are insults, and all those kinds of things happen. But the good thing is that people that troll and say all kinds of terrible things that humiliate and give all kinds of threats, people think that they can bully people into silence, but the protests will not go away. And they think that as long as they, when they bully, the protests will go away, but they don't. Because we've also seen the kind of counter backlash that happens. And of course, you had the tweets that were, and the messages that was, posted by the likes of Greta Thunberg and Mina Harris and Rihanna. But of course, I'm not trying to paint a very golden picture over here, because many digital campaigns against sexism were successful, that's true, but many of them were not. And there are some real threats as well to the lives and safety, to the safety and lives of digital activists. So for example, in China, young feminists were arrested for distributing pamphlets in a buzz. Leading actresses and filmmakers in Pakistan were trolled when they dared to tweet about sexual harassment. And in India, digital activists, online feminists are victims of sexual assault. Women continue to be victims of sexual assault, especially minority women, and that continues. There's also the culture of love jihad and honor crimes, and activists have been penalized. Right, so I just want to focus, bring our focus to India. And I want to talk about, what the situation on the ground, what the ground reality is. Since early 2000s, young tech-savvy millennial women have been agitating online against the culture of sexual violence in the country. And as we all know, the 2012 incident became the rape and murder incident of Nirbhaya. It became a flashpoint. This brutal rape triggered an unprecedented nationwide outcry, mostly by middle-class India. It was a politics that was inspired by a vocabulary of rights and modality of protest that were used by the youth across the world, such as, we saw some of the images of the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Tahrir Square that happened during the Arab Spring. So what we see is a new genre of feminist politics, where women begin to assert their right to be treated as equal fellow citizens. They challenge the subordination of their political identity to their moral identity. The 2012 protest and the movement demanded that the state criminalize sexual harassment, something that it hadn't done since the independence of the country. And the protest, as we know, in fact, in the end, forced the government to change its laws against rape and criminalize stalking, voyeurism, and acid attacks on women, etc., and also change the definition of rape. So this revolution can also be seen as a repudiation of the state, not only of the state, but also of the mainstream Indian feminist movement that have failed to deal with the everyday sexual harassment and the culture of socially sanctioned misogyny. Let's take a quick look at, since we are talking about the rise of the fourth wave of feminism, let's take a look at a very quick look at the feminist waves in India. So the first wave took place or rose in the 19th century as an anti-patriarchy and anti-colonial movement. In India, the second wave, roughly between the 1950s to the 1960s, which is more like an anti-class struggle against feudal oppression, against price rise, black marketing, corruption, and for trade and for land reform and union formation for trade union formation for women in the informal sector. The third wave that started around the 1970 onwards was an autonomous movement, women's movement, against all kinds of things such as dowry oppression, custodial rape of Mathura, Ramiza B, Suman Rani, etc. But this anti-rape movement that was led by the Indian women's movement was too sporadic and episodic for it to be transformed into a genuine civil rights issue. It was also blind to the caste issues that happened and during the Mandal agitations. The Indian women's movement was also underwent this massive phase of NGOization, and in a way it lost its autonomous identity. So the autonomous women's movement became, in the end, a career feminist movement for many. There was a general sense of detachment, because these kind of rapes, they happen to other women, they happen to minority women, and so on and so forth. And finally, the mainstream Indian feminist movement or women's movement wasn't able to provide guidance on everyday culturally sanctioned culture of sexual harassment, i.e. eve teasing to women everywhere. So the gap that was left open, in this gap, the leadership was provided by what I claim cyber feminists. And interestingly, what was important is the fact that the content and the method of resistance was a clear departure from the mainstream Indian feminist movement. So this new movement, the central to this new movement is this rights-bearing discourse of gender, where the focus is on questions of freedom, choice, and desire, i.e. elements which in the past were viewed with suspicion by those who were committed to the idea of the developmental nationalism. The Indian women's movement too had a narrower set of restrictive and protectionist concerns by placing limits on what women could do, what they could ask for. It saw gender in the public sphere only through the lens of the developmental state. It focused on employment, wages, education, housing, health, etc. Its examination of gender in the private sphere dealt with issues of maternal health, reproduction, female feticide, infanticide, the girl child marriage, dowry, etc. Sexuality, when it came to sexuality, it was strictly a private matter for the developmental state. It saw its public manifestation only in terms of sexual violence, against which women needed to be protected through controlling and disciplining their sexual behavior and policing their access to public spaces. The Indian women's movement was seen by the new brand of feminists like a stern mother telling women how to behave. It constrained and restricted their freedom and individuality by endless lists of rules and regulations. Clearly, it's not just misogynistic men or patriarchal ideology or sexist culture that regulated women's behavior. The task of controlling women's behavior had been taken over by feminism. As we recall, Sheila Dixit's characterization of the murdered journalist Soumya Vishwanathan as adventurous, or Maneka Gandhi's reference to the Lakshman Rekha, the discourse of the Lakshman Rekha in the context of Pinjra Tod. But buried underneath this protectionist zeal are, in fact, patriarchal anxieties about the shifting terrain of modern India since 1990. It's turned towards the 1990s neoliberal turn of the Indian economy, because among other things, it resulted in an unintended cultural shift in the country. It created massive job opportunities for women. Lots and lots of women began to step into the public space, which triggered anxieties for the conservative sections of the society that hadn't kept pace with the growing number of educated and professionally skilled women whose financial independence had completely changed their expectations and aspirations from life, which triggered a massive backlash from patriarchy that saw women's presence in public spaces as an act of provocation and a potential source of caste impurity. And to reclaim its centuries-old unearned control and privileges over women, there was an increased instance of male violence against women, against intercaste or interfaith marriages, or even friendships. So coming back to this new genre of feminism, women asserted their right to the pleasure of accessing public spaces, of reclaiming their body and sexuality in both private and public spaces, of choosing what to wear, choosing where and when to go, and with whom, choosing their intimate partners, delinking sexuality with reproduction, etc., which is a clear departure from the earlier movements of Indian feminist movements against sexual violence. And Menon and Nigam actually make the connection between economic globalization and the assertion of new aspirations, such as women choosing their own sexual partners, and the autonomy that comes with financial independence. Now, some critics have argued, have derided this new feminism as a middle-class phenomenon. But one must recall that the middle class in India has historically played an important role in, and I quote Maitri Chaudhary over here, in managing the ruling bloc, which included the bourgeoisie and the landed interests, and it continues to play a critical ideological role. And also the growing middle class helps the country position itself outside as an economic power, and then in turn garners greater political visibility and power within the state and society. So this movement, this new feminist movement, is at times often referred to as India's spring, as it resonated with other forms of agitations for plurality and inclusivity within the Dalit and Muslim minority communities, educational institutions, and the country's militarized zones. And I claim that this rights-based intersectional feminist movement, led by India's youth, not just by women, but men and non-binary subjectivities, it created a ripple effect for other struggles to break out, providing them with the, and I quote, the form, idiom, and language of protest. It inspired a large number of public intellectuals and members of the civic society to lay claim to their political citizenships. So this new rights vocabularies of the feminist movement challenged not only the culture of sexism, but also classism, casteism, and communalism. It asserted people's constitutional right to shape the future of the country's secular and plural identity. And the promise of this new feminist movement, therefore, is in this connection and is a critical breakthrough that has the potential to lay the ground for what I claim an Indian fourth wave feminism and a wider class-based struggle. Many of the trailblazers of the 2012 anti-rape movement, which eventually I see as an intersectional movement, many of the leaders many of the trailblazers provided leadership for other movements that followed, such as Justice for Vamola, Stand with JNU, Pinjra Tod, Chalo Ona, Dalit Women Fight, Not in My Name, and a further intensified movement against APSWA in Kashmir and Manipur. So making this link offers a chance to really push forward a different agenda that replaces the developmental state with a progressive alliance. Now, I'd like to sort of move on quickly to Shaheen Bagh, where we all know how women were at the forefront of this 2019 forefront of the protests against the 2019 citizenship laws in India, because they felt that they threatened the citizenship not only of Muslim people, but the citizenship rights of vulnerable groups like the Muslims, poor women, oppressed castes, and LGBT people. The Citizenship Amendment Act, as we all know, fast-tracks Indian citizenship for undocumented Muslim refugees from Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And the National Register of Citizens requires that all residents in India provide legal documentation to prove their citizenship by 2021, which is where we are now. And critics claim that the state is using these laws to redefine what it means to belong to India and to convert it into a Hindu nation. And when the two citizenship bills were announced, protests broke out in different parts of India, but women took leadership by means of a 3-month-long sit-in or occupation in a working class Delhi neighborhood of Shaheen Bagh. Students from little young women, as young as little children, to 19-year-old hijab-wearing women, and students and activists, they stopped all domestic chores in freezing temperatures, and they blocked a major Delhi highway. It was the most extraordinary act of resistance by Muslim women who have historically been known to be disenfranchised in India. After this, I'd like to move on to the the protests, sorry, the anti-farmer bill protests. And before I move on to that, I'd like to sort of quickly draw some kind of a comparison between the commonalities between the anti-CAA NRC bills and the farmers bill. And I'd like to claim that there are, a ton of commonalities, because both of them are, these protests were, at the center of these protests were this feminist agenda. The anti-CAA and NRC bills are anti-feminist because they will discriminate against women as they don't tend to have property papers in their own names. The strategies that were used by the Shaheen Bagh protesters were as follows. They were nonviolent. They used artwork and book readings and lectures and poetry recitals and songs and interfaith prayers and communal cooking, etc. They were inclusive because people from all communities joined in. They were secular because they used national symbols, i.e. the flag, the national anthem, the Indian constitution, to remind people of India's secularity and pluralism. And of course, as we know, it triggered many Shaheen Baghs across the country. So as I was saying, let's try to compare the Shaheen Bagh protests with the anti-farm bills protests. Both situations arose due to, and I quote, a democratic alienation and an increasing distance between the citizens and decision makers. Both challenge Indian women's essentializing, the essentializing of Indian women as victims in need of rescue. And both protests are tied to the idea of land. Women, especially minority women, due to patriarchy, poverty, war, etc., don't have papers to prove land ownership or house ownership, failing which they can be denied citizenship, or there is a real threat of denial of citizenship to them. And women farmers do stand to lose their livelihood with failing profit. And so let's just take a quick look at the farmers' protest. The Indian farmers are protesting the farm laws that were introduced during COVID without consulting the stakeholders. They argued that the laws that are supposedly aimed at liberalizing Indian agriculture will create private monopolies which will destroy the livelihood of small farmers. Given that 86% of Indian farmers are small landholders, they own less than 2 hectares of land, in the long run, this will destroy the soul of Indian culture. Also, we must remember that due to deregulation, this situation will not make food any cheaper for the consumers either. Because this is how the math of the globalized supply chain works. The farmer income will keep collapsing. They'll get only between 0.5 to a maximum of 5% of net proceeds. Consumers will continue to pay more and more for it. And the corporations, and not just national, but also multinational, because corporations, they don't have a nationality. They can sort of go across borders. These corporations will keep 95 to 99% of the net proceeds. So the farmers are fighting for food sovereignty and food imperialism, which in fact is a global struggle. So why is this a feminist issue? The protests, as we know, have mobilized women farmers who are out there shoulder to shoulder with their male counterparts. And in patriarchal agrarian societies, which are marked by massive gender inequality, where women have less access to household resources than men, and which is exacerbated due to the COVID-19 lockdown, and which stands to become even worse with these new laws. And since the protests are led by Punjab and Haryana, we need to understand that there is a warped sex ratio in these two states. There is a massive gender-based violence in these two states, massive economic inequality. And these two states, as a result, stand to lose the most during the farm bills, or due to the farm bills. The loss of farm income raises household debt, which is a main cause of farmer suicide. Suicide-affected families are more prone to income insecurity, and many women farmers do have actually committed suicide and are not actually, they don't tend to get counted. Women can't fend for their families as they don't own land, they're discouraged from taking on wage work, and they receive no welfare from the state. Women are direct and indirect contributors to agriculture, as we all know. They're equal participants in family-owned farm work, whether it's sowing and harvesting or threshing or winnowing, and they perform domestic labor. On top of that, they perform domestic labor, childcare, elderly care, and care of sick people, which they are doing even during the protests, ongoing protests. Just give me a second. Yet there is a bias against female farmers. They're called agricultural laborers and not farmers, and are paid less. The protests are their way of articulating their agency and identity, as they are the building blocks of the agrarian society or agrarian economy. So given all this, women's rebellion is remarkable as they exercise their agency, braving the elements, the police, and other kinds of barriers. Now, women have risen to save the farms before too, and I quote Vandana Shiva, who reminds us that in the aftermath of the Great Bengal famine that killed 2 million people, there rose a women's movement that fought for their rights to keep at least 2/3 of what they grew. That in many ways laid the ground for the Quit India movement and led to the independence and formed the basis of the Essential Commodities Act, which is now in the process of being taken down. And then of course you had the Chipko movement, which is the first feminist movement to save tree logging. Sorry about that. So by way of conclusion, one could say that by January 2019, women in nearly 90 countries had led street protests for equal pay, reproductive rights, end of violence, and other issues. And of course, as we all know, the coronavirus let's put a pause to these movements, street movements in particular. Anyway, so this is the reason why I'm giving the data of January 2019, where women in nearly 90 countries had led street protests. This inclusive activism, I claim, is at the core of the fourth wave feminism. Fourth wave feminism appears to be more universal. Today's activists fully embrace the idea that women's freedom means little if other groups are still oppressed. With its economic critique, disavowal of caste oppression, and solidarity across religious divides, India's Shaheen Bagh sit-in shares attributes with the women's uprisings in Chile, Lebanon, Hong Kong, and beyond. The farmers' protests too have resonated with people across the world, as we've seen in the very recent times. The last time women came together in such numbers worldwide was the #MeToo movement, which is a campaign against sexual harassment and which spread across the globe. Shaheen Bagh is similarly became a far-reaching women's uprising that was underway in other countries and which took the #MeToo campaign to the next levels. And not only Shaheen Bagh, but also the farmers' protests led to a large extent in the recent weeks by women. So both Shaheen Bagh and the women farmers protests, they take the #MeToo to the next level, moving from a purely feminist agenda to a wider call for social justice. And women protesters want rights, not just for themselves, but human rights for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alka. This was such an enriching talk. And I'm still thinking about those images from around the world that you shared, which was really fabulous. So we have, and I'd request my colleagues, Neil and Shriyashi, to also join us. And the three of us will be curating the questions from the audience and taking forward the conversation. Shriyashi, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you so much, Alka. It was a very insightful talk that we got. We've got one question that really wants to know about how women-centric protests like Shaheen Bagh can be looked at par with their digital rights-based movements that are taking place in online spaces, where women are asserting their self-autonomy in online public spaces. So how can such protests in the offline mode take place?
Right, as I said, online protests, I define the online protests or online or digital activism or digital feminist activism in a very broad sense of the term, because some of the protests are actually, some of the campaigns actually are born online. For example, Pink Chaddi, there was a Facebook group that started, and there's several other examples. And then the idea really is to, once a campaign is born online, the word is spread very quickly, the message is disseminated very quickly, it cascades very quickly, and then it leads to a street protest, offline street protest. But at other times, these things are not possible because not everyone has, because access to online technology is not universally accessible, right? Or it's not available. One must also make a distinction between the leaders of movements such as Pink Chaddi and Claim the Night and Slut Walk, etc., and members of the women members of the Shaheen Bagh protest, as well as the farmers' protest. There's clearly a difference, and I could say that at times this kind of a digital activism, i.e., that is led by members of the Pinjrathor activism, maybe not so much Pinjrathor, but Pink Chaddi, etc., you could potentially refer to that as some kind of a power feminism, which in a way is related, is sort of connected to neoliberal ideology, where the idea really is for the individual to place themselves within the overarching sort of struggle, rather than really do an analysis of systemic brutalization or systemic oppression. Yeah. Some critics have also referred to feminism that we perhaps see on the streets, such as Shaheen Bagh or the farmers' protest, as some kind of victim feminism, although I don't really like this expression because it sort of proceeds from the idea of feminists as being victims of structural oppression, which they are, but I don't like the expression. So that's just one of the ways of looking at it. But so quite apart from looking at the ways in which these two different kinds of feminisms articulate themselves, the other interesting thing is, when I refer to digital feminism, feminist leaders themselves may not be using the digital medium to advocate themselves. It is the images that get captured of the protests that are happening, which then get transmitted across the world, and the response that they receive, either in terms of the support those feminists garner on the ground. For example, the kind of community support, there was the massive amount of community support that the women farmer protesters received, or they start to get protests from across the world, as we've seen in recent weeks. The Arab Spring, we must remind ourselves, actually happened as a result of this Tunisian fruit seller who, because he was so frustrated because of the corrupt police, that one of the police members of the police force had been bullying him and all, and one day he was so angry that he poured petrol on himself and set himself on fire, and someone took a picture, a video of it, and posted it online, and that was the start of the Arab Spring. So you see, one must make a distinction between the agents of these movements. They may not come from the same social class, the same kind of an ideological background, but the impact is the same.
Thank you so much. I think it's kind of related again to this question about the online spaces that I want to ask next. And the question is about basically how in academic spaces and beyond, we're trying to destabilize the universal category of women altogether and make gender wider and more inclusive for non-binary categories, identities. And I want to extrapolate a little bit from that, to think about Me Too along the same lines, and in some sense, to use the word you were saying, cyber feminism, and the recent movements like Me Too might have garnered around shared experiences of a particular gender. So how do we reconcile this kind of tension that's now developing? And as we know, there have been various critiques of the Me Too movement, or the perceived split between queer movements or queer positionalities and feminist positionalities and feminist movements. So how do you see this kind of tension?
Right. I think the one thing that we need to first of all acknowledge that there are these slippages between various waves of the movement, right? So when the Me Too movement happened, there was this absolute immediate backlash in the United States from the African-American community. They said, well, hang on a minute, the movement was actually started by Tarana Burke 10 years ago, right? So there is that tension. Then the Me Too movement, then it was projected as far too middle class, in countries across the world, in India as well. We also must remember that Me Too movement was not the only movement, was not the first time when women had started to sort of share their experiences of sexual harassment. You remember there was, you don't obviously remember, but we must recall, we must sort of remind ourselves of what used to be referred to as these whisper circles where women, working women, professional women in the 80s, maybe even in the 70s, late 70s to 80s, they were sort of talking amongst each other in cafes and rest areas, etc., about sexual harassment. We also have to remember that not everyone felt comfortable, talking about these issues. Women have been blogging, women have been sort of keeping diaries, talking about their experiences of sexual harassment. So that's the one thing, that's one kind of a critique. Secondly, the Me Too movement did not take into account the kind of harassment experienced by Dalit women. The Me Too movement was, ended up becoming very cisgender, did not take into account the other kinds of, positionalities that were being articulated and so on and so forth. So the idea really is for us to understand, is to make sure that there is no universal understanding of any of these things happening. And the other thing that we need to remind ourselves of is the newness of this movement that is happening. And there are these slippages that keep happening between different political positionalities, between gendered positionalities, between class positionalities, between ethnic and regional and national positionalities.
Thank you so much.
Professor Kurian, thank you so much for that rich conversation and taking us through some of these ideas. So since also your work is on, studying transnational film and media practices, how do you think media practices, for example, films and digital art, are contributing to our thinking around contemporary feminist issues?
Can you repeat the last sentence? How is film and
how do you think digital art and films, media practices are in some sense contributing to our thinking around these issues, especially when we're seeing the rise in those strategies?
Right. I think we are seeing a surge of representations in the media. Indian cinema has been responding to it. And not only Indian cinema, but also television series such as 4 More Shots, Please, Made in Heaven, and films such as Lipstick, Under My Burqa, Veere the Wedding, and all of these kind of things, all of these kind of cinematic narratives and other kinds of fictional narratives are pushing the boundaries. There's a backlash against 4 More Shots, Please, because it's deemed to be very middle class. Even within the diaspora, there's a big divide within the South Asian diaspora in the United States. There's a big divide between among people about the authenticity of these representations. So I think the media is definitely responding to it, but at the same time, well, interestingly, the media has been at the forefront of taking this conversation further at every step of the way. Bollywood, unfortunately, has of late become regressive. So I think there's a crack even within mainstream, Indian film industry, where there is a departure between, or there's a tension between a particular kind of nationalistic, regressive representation of femininity and masculinity and how the indie cinema is presenting it. I think interestingly for us, online platforms such as Netflix and Amazon, in so many ways they've liberated, representation and even creation of this particular kind of art. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, of course, some people say it's very middle class, but then having said that, if you take a look at a film like Lipstick, that's not middle class at all. If you take a film like Parch, that's not middle class. In fact, it's located in provincial India. Right? Yeah.
That's true.
Mhm.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was very insightful. We also have another question taking from your conversation on the Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring in the 20th century, it had created multiple factions that tried to gain power to overthrow the authoritarian government. And your discussion of the Arab Spring right now is more about the feminist struggle for accomplishment of broader goals of the feminism. So how do you view this current Arab Spring for feminism, knowing that its roots actually lie in the nationalist movement, and that nationalism is typically a symptom of masculinity and masculine expression? So how do we sort of tie that together?
Right. In fact, that's also what I thought, that the Arab Spring was a masculinist movement. But if you actually look at representation, because we're talking about representation, you know, what kind of narratives get represented. So there was this fascinating film called The Square. It's a documentary film. I don't know if you've seen it. It's on Netflix, and that film it's a documentary film on the Arab Spring. And I actually watched this film around the time when I was doing research on this, and I was fascinated to see the participation of women in the Arab Spring movement. Massive amount of women were present. And of course, I'm not saying at all that it was I'm not trying to paint a very rosy picture of this, because there was also terrible amount of sexual violence that happened as well. There was this case of an image of which eventually went viral, and I don't have it to share with you, but you know, you might take a look at it. There was a case of this burqa-clad woman that was dragged by the police, and as she's being dragged, you know, her entire burqa, her entire veil, you know, sort of gets pulled off her body, and you see, you know, her body in her underwear, and that in fact became, you know, a rallying cry for a lot of women to sort of come together and men to come together in acts of solidarity. There were these. I have this fantastic book called the Bad Girls of the Arab World, and if you take a look at, you know, all of these chapters, they articulate the agency expressed by women, you know, in various ways. The Arab Spring didn't just take place in the shape of, you know, protests on the street. The Arab Spring also took place in the ways in which women represented themselves in the media, in art, the art that they made, or the photographs that they took of themselves and posted online, you know, in poetry and all of those kind of things. So, and of course, the Arab Spring failed in so many ways. But the interesting thing, the interesting contribution of the Arab Spring is to see is in the way in which it mobilized a lot of attention and garnered a lot of support across the world, and contributed a particular kind of language of protest. And it was the first social media movement that then inspired other movements to break out. You know, for example, in Morocco, there was a February 20th movement that took place. It was led by women against state oppression. It also broke out in Algeria and in other places in the world, in the MENA region. So one of the things that I'd like to do, and in fact, you know, this is the research that I'm doing on global fourth wave feminism, is to actually look at the ways in which certain narratives were not foregrounded, certain narratives were not centered, and certain voices were erased. And the idea really for me is to go and really look for and do research and talk to women and to find out the kind of engagement that they had with the mainstream Arab Spring movement that happened at that time. And of course, there are no easy answers for this at all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alka. In some sense, actually, one of the questions from the audience is kind of related to what you were just speaking. And the person is asking that they're wondering if the endless diffusion of solidarities and kinships enabled by the digital space also leaves temporality fraught in the constant reproduction of images. Is there a danger that activism is solely reduced to the visceral, contained in the moments of aesthetic representation versus the structural changes? So if you want to elaborate more on that at all.
Yeah, I think what you are referring to is, or what the person who's asked this question is referring to, this activism that just gets reduced to clicktivism. You've
Yeah.
liked and you've shared, and that's where it is. And of course, there is always that problem. I do that too, in so many ways, because there is information overload. There's an information fatigue. There's empathy and sympathy fatigue. It's very difficult to sort of keep track of everything that's happening. But that's part of the process, right? But what we have to also remember is that at a time when feminism had acquired a bad reputation, right? In the United States or in the Western world, people had started talking about post-feminism. Feminism wasn't relevant anymore. Maybe people had achieved, realized achieved gender equality. Feminism, maybe some people thought that feminism had gone too far, and there was this backlash against feminism, and so we arrive in a context of post-feminism, and that's the reason why when the Me Too campaign broke out, everyone took attention. I say, oh my goodness, women are still proactively participating in the feminist movement. So one must one must acknowledge the role played by those feminists who, through the use of social media, were pushing the feminist agenda forward. Clicktivism notwithstanding, because that'll happen everywhere. Because even when you, for example, if you take a look at the 2012 or any kind of movements that have happened, where people have congregated in Jantar Mantar and other kind of places, there's a lot of people just hang around. They're just there for the fun of it. They just want to know what's happening, or they're silent spectators, or they don't dare really articulate themselves. So I think what we are seeing on the net, online, the activism online, is a reproduction of a similar kind of different, layers of engagement that people have. Some people are at the forefront, some people are not. And of course, a lot of people are also scared of articulating themselves, because I'm not at all saying that articulating yourself on the digitally is necessarily seen as a positive force by a lot of people, because people are terrified of saying anything. So people are self-censoring themselves, and I've started to self-censor myself, because I'm now worried, who's actually reading my clicks, who's analyzing my likes, so there are all kinds of things that are happening.
Yeah, and I think what you just said at the end, especially in the Indian context, after at least one of the states passing that mandate that there'll be a screening of your social media before visas are issued, that's a genuine concern that social media does become a surveillance. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Professor Kurian, another question. And since you're always also talking about post-feminism and feminism, so there's a question that says, even among feminists, feminism is a contested concept. And often we see women's movements disassociating themselves from feminism. Is it because of a certain kind of Western Eurocentric emergence and usage of the term? What do you think about this? And to also add on it, we also see the rise in categorizations, right? Trans feminism, Dalit feminism. What do you think of this disassociation and creating newer channels?
Right. So that's again a real problem, right? So there are lots of responses to it. I think feminism mustn't be understood as some kind of a hegemonic movement, a universalizing movement that essentializes and encapsulates, the needs of, everyone under one banner. It's a fantasy, right? There are cracks within the movement. There are these tensions. There are slippages between different waves of the movement. There's slippages and tensions and conflicts within ideological positionalities, right? Let alone regional, ethnic, national, etc. So the beauty of feminism, and in particular, and of course, this is work in progress, right? I'm still working on it. I started working on this fourth wave feminism, let's say about 3 years ago, and it's a slow process. What I would say is that it is actually a good thing for feminism to be a contested concept, because there isn't a universal concept of feminism, right? Because digital feminists, they were unhappy with the members of the mainstream Indian women's movement because they felt betrayed, right? Women had been helping with the economic growth of the country at the time of the neoliberal turn of the country, going out and working at night. And, of course, a lot of these jobs were exploitative jobs, but at the same time, they were putting in their labor, but the state didn't respond. The state didn't sort of ensure their safety. And there was this immediate sort of backlash against the presence of women on the streets, right? So there was a clear departure from, what women wanted. And when they didn't they provided leadership, and they sort of branched off and asserted themselves and articulated a new genre of feminism, right? Now, whether, and of course, at the same time, then the Dalit feminists, they felt that feminist movement had become too Savarna, too middle class, too bourgeois, or too Hindu, upper caste Hindu. And trans feminists didn't feel represented at all by either of these kind of representations of feminism. Now, so that's, so I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing. And the more there are these cracks, the more we can begin to understand it as a holistic and inclusive and plural. And I think all these plural definitions of feminisms is a welcome thing. Second, feminism as being a Western thing. I think I have a big problem with that, because when the establishment, when the political regime refers to feminism and derides feminism as a Western concept, it is actually saying that everything Western is bad. Now, of course, we have to remember that the foundation of the Indian independence, the new India was founded on concepts that were learned by the founders of New India, by Nehru and Gandhi. They actually studied. They went to England and they got all these ideas, about anti-colonialism and imperialism and fascism and all of those kind of things, democracy and all, and they brought it to India, right? So we must remember that. Second, India is actually modern India. India has actually never been, since 1990s, India has not been anti-Westernization at all. If you go to the malls, the malls in the metropolises in India, they look like the malls anywhere in the world. The kind of fascination that people have for cars, for Western technology, no. Where Westernization becomes a problem is when women begin to assert, or when people begin to assert their agency. And so Westernization is then used as a stick to beat them with. That's my problem. So it's not a Western idea. And even if it is a Western idea, it has sort of taken different kinds of forms and shapes. Like, for example, feminism on the African continent, feminism in the MENA region, feminism everywhere. Feminism, in fact, is a political positionality for assertion of liberation and freedom, right? If you want to call, in what way is it a Western idea? I don't understand that at all. And talking about representation, there was this fascinating film called Shuddh Desi Romance. I don't know whether you saw it. And there was this girl who had no context, no connection with the West, and she's articulating her sexual freedom, in a small place without, and I don't know whether she's able to speak. I think she also probably doesn't know how to speak in English, and it's not just her, like this kind of a tension of, representation of one and expression of one's sexual identity and agency was fascinating. It wasn't a Western idea at all, or it wasn't couched in a Western context at all. I think I've sort of answered your question. Yes. Yeah.
It's like one is comfortable flaunting their Gucci, but the sexual autonomy becomes a Western concept suddenly.
Exactly. Yeah. Because there is a fear of women asserting and actually realizing their sexual autonomy. Because as we know that there is, in fact, all this, like women need to be protected from their desires, women need to be safe because there's sexual violence that happens on the streets. And, I think all of this is a result of the fear of patriarchy, of losing its unearned privileges, right? And also there is the fear of caste impurity. That's a different kind of conversation.
Thank you, Professor Alka. Because we've been talking about cyber feminism and cyber activism, one of our audience members has this question where they want to know that, methodologically speaking, what do you think are the best ways to study and track online protests, considering how varied they are, how manifold they are, and how they spread across the internet like a web? So how can we track them better?
That is an interesting question that I'll have to think about the response to. I need to do that. I'm sorry. I've been sort of looking more at the political significance of cyber feminism, but I haven't done that. That's
we can come back to that question, later. Sorry, so I think this will have to be our last question since we're running out of time, but this is directly leading from what we were just talking about. And I just wanted to ask you, especially because there's that, pitting that happens when we talk about feminism and feminist issues, particularly in India, against the sort of discourse of traditions, religion, particularly something around when the Sabrimala movement became such a huge thing. And again, certain feminists were pitted against other women who were coming out in the support of it. I'm just wondering, and this is going broader from this, I'm wondering whether you think that we are also reaching perhaps to a certain limits of rights-based discourse and rights-based language, although I know that you were speaking about that as being the core of fourth wave of feminism that you're thinking about. But I wonder, especially, again, thinking about, for instance, sexual and reproductive rights-based activism, which has been there for some time, but again, that hasn't yet come to a place where we can still think about desire, think about pleasure in the ways that are outside of those, again, reproductive rights category. So what do you just think about the way we see rights-based activism right now?
I would think that I'm not sure if I understand your question. Are you saying that it has reached its limit, rights-based activism, where everyone's asserting their right?
Not necessarily. I think what I'm also referring to, for instance, I think around debates around sexual harassment discourse right now, where a lot of people are thinking about how framing of the entire problem in terms of consent as something which is framed in terms of rules, etc., might not always play out that way because, for instance, sexual encounters don't play out necessarily in the ways that you expect. So I'm wondering if you think that some of the movements within what you've referred to as the fourth wave movements are in fact movements that have tried to go beyond necessarily just the language of rights or language of sovereign self, which is attached to a particular set of rights that the state or the legal apparatuses endow upon the individual. So just what you think might be happening, or for instance, how some of these movements within the fourth wave feminism that you're calling might be different from one another.
Right. I think the only thing that I can say, if I'm able to answer your question, and if I've understood the essence of your question, the only thing that I can say is that yes, it is true that the expression of rights might be taken too far. But at the same time, I think what we are seeing is a situation of contestation and battle, and we'll have to see where it goes. Because I think it's too early to say anything. I don't think I'm able to answer that question very well. I have to think more about it. Sorry.
No, thank you so much. And I think precisely because you're saying it's such a complex terrain is something that we'll all need to think about further. But thank you so much for addressing so many questions in such an expansive manner that we're able to think about these multiple directions with which to think about the issues that feminism takes up in general. There are many more unanswered questions in the chat box. Sorry to you all, but I hope that Professor Kurian's talk has given you various directions for pursuing the questions that you're interested in. Once again, thank you so much, Professor Kurian, for joining us tonight. And thank you all for attending the event. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege, and I'm deeply honored to have been given this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.